The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the sterile hum of machines and the faint smell of disinfectant. I stared at the ceiling, numb to everything around me. I had just lost our baby, the life we had so desperately hoped for. My heart was shattered into a million pieces, and all I wanted was Mark by my side, to grieve with me, to hold me, to tell me it wasn't my fault. But when I looked at him, standing near the door, his eyes were cold, distant. The man who had promised me forever seemed miles away. I tried to reach out, to pull him into my grief, but he didn't move. I don't know what to say, he muttered, his voice emotionless. You should have been more careful. I froze, feeling the words sink in, each one a sharp knife twisting in my chest. What? I whispered, barely able to comprehend what I was hearing. You were supposed to take care of yourself, of the baby, he continued, his eyes hardening. But you didn't. You failed us. I thought we'd grieve together, that we would mourn as a team, a family. Instead, he blamed me for the unthinkable and walked away, leaving me in a hospital bed to face the devastation alone. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Before everything fell apart, Mark and I had a life that seemed straight out of a storybook. We lived in a beautiful, quiet, suburban neighborhood in Seattle, our dream home, nestled between lush green trees, with a small garden in the backyard that I loved tending to. It was the kind of place where we imagined raising a family, where our future seemed so bright, so certain. We met at a mutual friend's wedding 5 years ago. I still remember the way he looked at me that night, as if no one else in the room existed. He was charming, attentive, and made me laugh like no one else could. Our connection was instant, the kind of whirlwind romance people talk about in movies. Before long, we were inseparable. Every date, every moment felt like it was leading to something bigger, something permanent. It didn't take long for Mark to propose. I remember the night clearly. He took me to a quiet spot overlooking the Puget Sound, got down on one knee, and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. Of course, I said yes. We were happy. We were in love. The years that followed were filled with laughter, adventure, and dreams of starting a family. When we found out I was pregnant, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. We spent hours preparing for the baby's arrival, shopping for tiny clothes, painting the nursery in soft shades of yellow, and imagining what our child's laugh would sound like. But as perfect as things seemed, there was always a shadow lurking in the background. Isabel, Mark's first love. He'd occasionally mention her in passing, a wistful tone in his voice. She was the one that got away, as he jokingly called her once, but I never took it seriously. After all, Mark and I were building a life together. I brushed off any concerns, convinced that what we had was stronger than some lingering feelings for a woman from his past. Looking back now, maybe I should have paid more attention to those moments, those little comments that seemed harmless at the time. But I was so focused on the baby, on our future, that I ignored the signs. Then came the day that changed everything. It had started like any other. Mark and I were sitting in the living room, discussing baby names. I felt a sharp pain in my abdomen, something I dismissed as just a pregnancy ache. But the pain grew worse, more intense, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. We rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding in fear. I tried to stay positive, tried to convince myself it was just a false alarm, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. When the doctor came into the room, his face solemn, I already knew what he was going to say. We had lost the baby. The world shattered in that moment. Everything I had imagined, everything we had planned, disappeared in an instant. I looked at Mark, hoping he'd pull me close, tell me it would be okay. But instead, he stood there, distant, silent, as if he wasn't really in the room at all. That day, everything changed. I lost our baby, and somewhere along the way, I began to lose Mark too. The days after the miscarriage felt like a blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, unable to shake the numbness that had settled over me. I expected that Mark and I would lean on each other, that we'd find some way to heal together. But instead of comforting me, he grew distant. At first, it was small things. Him staying late at work, avoiding conversations about the baby, barely touching me. I convinced myself he was grieving in his own way. After all, it wasn't easy for either of us. But as the weeks went by, it became impossible to ignore his coldness. He wasn't just grieving, he was shutting me out. One evening, as I was washing the dishes, he walked into the kitchen, barely glancing at me. I turned to him, desperate for some kind of connection. "Mark, can we talk about this? I feel like you're not here with me." He stiffened, not meeting my eyes. "There's nothing to talk about," he said flatly. "It's over. We lost the baby, and we can't change that." "I know we can't change it, but we're supposed to be in this together," I said, my voice trembling. "I need you, Mark. I can't get through this alone." He sighed, finally looking at me, but there was no warmth in his gaze. "You should have been more careful." The words hit me like a slap. "What?" I asked, not sure I had heard him right. "You should have taken better care of yourself," he continued, his tone cold and detached. "Maybe then this wouldn't have happened." I felt my throat tighten, a wave of disbelief washing over me. "You think this is my fault?" I whispered. "I'm not saying it's all your fault," he muttered, turning away. "But you could have been more responsible." Tears welled up in my eyes. The guilt was already there, gnawing at me, but hearing him say it, hearing him blame me, made it so much worse. I had done everything I could. I had followed every doctor's order, every guideline. How could he think I had failed? From that day forward, Mark became colder, more distant. When I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off, retreating into his own world. He started spending nights out with old friends, people I had never met or heard about until now. He would leave in the evening, sometimes not returning until late into the night, if at all. And every time I asked where he'd been, he'd just shrug and say, "Out." I was drowning in grief, and he wasn't there to pull me out. Instead, he seemed to be using it as an excuse to disappear. One night, after another late return, I confronted him. "Who are you with, Mark?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Where are you going every night?" He looked at me with irritation. "You're being paranoid," he snapped. "I need space. Can't you see that?" "Space?" I repeated, feeling the hurt rise in my chest. "We lost our baby, and you want space from me? I'm your wife, Mark. I'm the one who needs you." He didn't respond, didn't try to comfort me. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and left, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, trembling, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. As the weeks passed, the distance between us only grew. Mark continued his late nights, his cold silences, his barely there presence. And the more I tried to reach out, the more he pulled away. My mind began racing with questions, doubts. Was he hiding something from me? Was there someone else? I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The late nights, the lies, the way he avoided me as if I were a stranger. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just grieving, he was running. I noticed the change in Mark long before I learned about Isabel. His late nights, the endless excuses, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked where he had been. He was slipping away, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, I could feel him pulling further into his own world. Then, one evening, it all clicked into place. I was going through some old boxes in the attic, trying to distract myself from the tension that had been building between us. In one of the boxes, I found an old photo of Mark and a woman I had never met, smiling and holding each other like they were the happiest people in the world. I recognized her immediately, Isabel, his first love, the woman he used to describe as the one that got away. We had talked about her before, back when our relationship was solid, when I didn't feel the need to be jealous. He would mention her in passing, how they had met in college, how their relationship was full of passion, but ultimately didn't work out. I never felt threatened by her, not back then. I had convinced myself that our love was stronger, that he had moved on. But now, holding the picture in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Later that evening, I decided to confront him. As we sat on the couch, the silence between us thick with unspoken words, I finally asked, "Have you talked to Isabel recently?" Mark looked up from his phone, surprised. "What?" "Isabel, your ex. Have you been talking to her?" He hesitated for just a moment, and that hesitation was all I needed to know. "Yeah," he admitted, setting his phone down. "We've been catching up." "Catching up?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Why now? After all these years?" He shrugged, trying to act casual, but I could see the tension in his posture. "She reached out a few weeks ago. Just wanted to see how I was doing. It's nothing serious." Nothing serious. The words echoed in my head. Nothing serious. But it felt serious. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous, something that could tear us apart even more. I pressed him further. "So you've just been chatting? Nothing more?" "Yeah, that's it," he said, his voice a little too quick, too defensive. "She's going through some stuff, and I figured I'd be a friend. It's no big deal." But it was a big deal. It felt like a betrayal, like he was slipping away from me even more, and now Isabel was the one pulling him further into the distance. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Isabel wasn't just some distant memory anymore. She was a wedge, driving itself deeper between us. Mark was spending more time out of the house, claiming he was with friends, but I knew better. I knew that she was the one on his mind. One evening, after yet another late night, I finally snapped. "Are you seeing her, Mark?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of my fear. He sighed, rubbing his temples like this conversation was an inconvenience. "You're being paranoid," he said, his tone cold. "I told you we're just catching up." "Then why are you spending all your time with her instead of me?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why are you shutting me out?" "Because I can't deal with this right now," he snapped. "You're smothering me. Isabel gets it. She's been through stuff too." There it was, the admission I had been dreading. He was leaning on her, not me. Isabel had become his escape, his comfort, and I was left on the outside, watching the man I loved drift further away with every passing day. I stood there numb, feeling the walls of our once happy home closing in around me. He might not have said it outright, but I knew. Isabel wasn't just some old flame. She was becoming something more, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it. The truth hit me like a freight train. I had suspected something was wrong for weeks, but when I heard it from a mutual friend, my worst fears were confirmed. Mark had moved in with Isabel. I stood frozen in the middle of our living room, my phone still clutched in my hand as the words echoed in my mind. "Moved in with her." My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea washed over me. How could he do this? How could he leave me, especially now? The sound of the door opening broke my trance, and I turned to see Mark walking in, his expression unreadable. I had no idea how to start, but the words tumbled out of me before I could stop them. "You moved in with her," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair, but didn't deny it. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I did." I stared at him, my heart pounding in disbelief. "You left me. After everything we've been through, after we lost our baby, you left me for her?" Mark's face tightened, his frustration evident. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," I shot back, my voice trembling. "Make me understand why the man who was supposed to be my partner, my husband, is living with someone else, and not just someone else, her." He hesitated for a moment, then sighed again, this time more deeply. After the miscarriage, I didn't know how to handle it. You were falling apart, and I didn't know how to be there for you. I tried, but it was too much. I felt my chest tighten with anger. I was falling apart? We lost our baby, Mark. I was grieving. I needed you, and instead of helping me, you ran away to Isabel? He didn't look at me. She understood. She's been through similar things. I could talk to her in a way I couldn't talk to you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So what? You're saying I couldn't understand you? That Isabel, the woman you used to love, could? Mark finally met my eyes, and I saw the guilt there, but it only made me angrier. You were grieving in your own way, and I didn't know how to handle that. I couldn't deal with my own pain because I was too busy trying to keep us together. I shook my head, my hands trembling. So you found comfort in her instead? Do you hear yourself, Mark? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we were building together. You left me when I needed you most. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice quieter now. I needed something different, something I couldn't find here. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought them back. I didn't want him to see how broken I was, how deeply his betrayal had cut. So you replaced me? You replaced us? It's not like that, he said quickly. I'm not replacing you. I can't be what you need anymore. I can't be here. I felt the ground beneath me crumbling. Not only had I lost our baby, but I had lost my husband too. Everything I thought I could count on, everything we had planned, was gone in the blink of an eye. Mark stood there, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration, as if he had convinced himself that what he was doing was somehow justified. But I couldn't justify it. I couldn't find any way to make sense of the fact that the man I had loved and trusted had walked away, only to find solace in the arms of someone else. I gave you everything, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, and you just walked away. I'm sorry, he said, his voice soft, but I can't change what happened. I stood there, silent, as Mark grabbed his keys and headed toward the door. He glanced back at me, as if expecting me to say something, but I couldn't. I had nothing left to give. The door closed behind him, and I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had lost my baby, my husband, and somewhere along the way, I had lost myself too. The house felt emptier than ever. Every room, every corner held a memory of what could have been. Our future, our family, the life Mark and I had built together. But now it was all gone. The walls felt like they were closing in, filled with the weight of unspoken dreams and shattered promises. I wandered through the quiet rooms, stopping in what was supposed to be the baby's nursery. The pale yellow walls were still freshly painted, and a few unopened boxes of baby clothes sat neatly in the corner, untouched. My heart ached as I ran my fingers along the edge of the crib, which had been so carefully assembled. I had envisioned our baby here, a new chapter in our lives, but now all those dreams had turned to dust. The grief was overwhelming. It wasn't just the loss of our child, it was the loss of everything. The future I had envisioned with Mark, the man I thought I knew, had been ripped away from me, leaving behind only a hollow, painful void. I sank onto the couch, clutching a pillow to my chest as the tears came, hot and heavy. Grief is such a strange thing. One moment, it feels distant, like it belongs to someone else, and the next, it crushes you with the full weight of everything you've lost. And I had lost so much. For days, I let myself mourn. I cried for the baby I would never hold, for the husband I had lost to his own demons, for the life I thought I was building, but never truly had. But slowly, something started to change. Somewhere in the midst of all that grief, a flicker of strength began to emerge. I wasn't sure where it came from. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was the quiet voice inside me that knew I deserved more than what I had been given. But that flicker started to grow, day by day. It wasn't a sudden change, more like a slow realization. I had to keep going. I had to rebuild. Not for Mark, not for the life we had lost, but for me. One afternoon, I reached out to Lena, my best friend. She had been calling and texting me for weeks, but I hadn't been ready to talk. Now, I was. I needed someone to help me through this, to remind me that I wasn't as alone as I felt. "Lena, can we talk?" I said, my voice cracking as I dialed her number. Within an hour, she was at my door, her arms wrapping around me in the kind of hug that says everything words can't. She didn't ask me for details, didn't push me to talk right away. She just sat with me, letting me cry, letting me grieve. "I feel like I've lost everything," I whispered after a while. "The baby, Mark. I don't even know who I am anymore." "You haven't lost yourself," she said gently. "You're still here. And I know it feels impossible now, but you're stronger than you think. You'll get through this." I wanted to believe her, but it felt so far out of reach. How could I possibly move on from everything that had happened? How could I rebuild when it felt like the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me? But Lena was right. I was still here. And that meant there was still a chance for me to find my way forward, to rebuild a life that was mine, without Mark, without the dream that had been shattered. Over the next few weeks, I started taking small steps. I packed away the baby's things, storing them carefully in the attic. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it was a necessary step in letting go. I rearranged the house, making it feel less like the space Mark and I had shared, and more like a place that belonged to me. I leaned on Lena and my family for support, surrounding myself with people who reminded me that I was loved, that I wasn't alone. Slowly, the empty house began to feel less like a place of loss and more like a blank canvas, ready for me to create something new. One day, I stood in the middle of the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, it was still there, lingering like an old wound. But I knew, in that moment, that I was going to be okay. I had survived the worst, and I had come out the other side. Mark's betrayal didn't define me. The miscarriage didn't define me. I was more than my losses, more than my heartbreak. I was ready to start over. It had been months since Mark left. Months of learning to rebuild, to heal, to find strength in myself. The house felt lighter now, not filled with the suffocating memories of loss and betrayal. I had started to move on. So when the doorbell rang one crisp autumn morning, I wasn't prepared for the face I saw when I opened it. Mark stood there, looking worn down, his eyes clouded with guilt. His once confident posture was now slouched, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his choices had finally crushed him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than I remembered. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but another part, the part that had once loved him so deeply, still lingered, even if only as a distant memory. So I stepped aside, letting him in, knowing that whatever he had to say wouldn't change the outcome. He sat down on the couch, the same couch where we had spent countless evenings planning our future, dreaming of the life we'd have together. It all felt so far away now, like another lifetime. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice shaky. "I made a huge mistake, leaving you like that." I stayed silent, my arms crossed as I leaned against the doorway. I wasn't ready to make this easy for him. He swallowed, looking down at his hands. "Things with Isabel, they fell apart. She wasn't what I thought she was, and He stopped, his face twisted in regret. "I didn't know how to handle the miscarriage. I was grieving too. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. I thought Isabel could help me, but I was wrong." I stared at him, my heart heavy but calm. "And now you're here because what, Mark? You think I'll just take you back?" He shook his head quickly, guilt flooding his features. "No, I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was so lost, and I didn't know how to be there for you." My chest tightened at his words, not out of love, but out of sadness for the person I used to be, the person who would have wanted to hear this months ago. But that person was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to live without him. "I was grieving too, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "But I didn't abandon you. I didn't run to someone else when things got hard. I stayed, and I faced the pain head on. You didn't." "I know," he whispered, his head hanging low. "I wasn't strong enough, but I've realized how much I still love you, how much I want to make things right." I looked at him, really looked at him, and all I felt was nothing. No anger, no hatred, but no love either. He was just someone I used to know. Someone who had once been everything to me, but had thrown it all away. "I'm not that person anymore, Mark," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not the woman who needs you to complete her life. I've rebuilt myself without you, and I'm happier for it." He stared at me, desperation flickering in his eyes. "But I can change. I can be better." "No," I said firmly. "It's too late. I deserved better than what you gave me, and I found peace knowing that I'm worth more than the way you treated me." He looked crushed, but I didn't soften. I had given him everything, and he had left me in my darkest hour. That was something I could never forget, no matter how much he apologized. "I'm sorry, Mark," I said quietly, "but you need to leave." He stood slowly, his face pale with regret. He didn't argue, didn't plead again. He knew it was over. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment, as if hoping I would change my mind. But I didn't. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. It was over, truly over, and for the first time in months, I felt free. My new apartment in downtown Seattle felt like a breath of fresh air. It was smaller than the house I'd once shared with Mark, but it was mine, a space that I had created for myself. The city skyline framed the windows, and every morning I watched the sun rise over the water, filling my new life with light and hope. This was my new beginning, and it felt like I was finally free of the shadows that had followed me for so long. It had been months since Mark's visit, months since he begged for a second chance. I'd told him it was too late, and it was. There was no going back to the person I had been when we were together. I had learned too much, grown too much, to ever return to that place of pain and betrayal. Now, I focused on my career, throwing myself into projects that excited and challenged me. Work had become a form of therapy, a way to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self-worth. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had forgotten about, parts that had been overshadowed by the weight of grief and loss. I often reflected on the journey I had gone through, how everything I thought I knew had crumbled around me, how the miscarriage had broken me in ways I hadn't expected, and how Mark's betrayal had only deepened that wound. But through it all, I had found strength. I had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward, always a path to healing. It hadn't been easy. There were still days when the memories would creep in, uninvited and sharp, reminding me of what I had lost. But those days were fewer now, and they no longer held the same power over me. Instead of feeling trapped by the pain, I acknowledged it, let it pass, and then moved on. The grief, the anger, the hurt, it was all a part of me, but it didn't define me anymore. I wasn't the woman who had been left behind. I wasn't the woman who had been broken by loss. I was someone new, someone stronger. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker below, I thought about Mark. I didn't hate him anymore. I had let go of that anger because I knew it wasn't serving me. He had made his choices, and they had led him down a different path. But I had made my choices too, choices that had led me here, to this moment of peace and self-acceptance. I would never forget what had happened. I would never forget the pain of losing my baby or the heartbreak of watching my marriage crumble. but I no longer carried that pain with me like a burden. It was a part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. As I stood up and walked inside, I glanced at the framed photo of myself and Lena from a recent weekend getaway. We had gone hiking, and I remembered how alive I had felt, surrounded by nature, laughing with my friend. That was the future I was excited about, the friendships I had, the adventures I hadn't yet experienced, the life that was waiting for me. I had learned something invaluable through all of this. My worth wasn't tied to anyone else's love or validation. I was enough, just as I was, and I deserved a life that reflected that. With a smile, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, ready to meet Lena for dinner. The night air was cool, and the streets were bustling with energy. For the first time in a long time, I felt light, unburdened by the past. As I walked into the city, I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready. I had faced the worst and come out stronger. Now, it was time to embrace the life I had always deserved, on my own terms and without fear.